Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hello everyone. Good morning and welcome to yet another session of Weekend with Wisdom. We have Sri Ramesh Venkatraman with us, who will be continuing his yesterday's session on Vishnu Sahasranam. To those who could not attend yesterday, just a brief introduction to Ramesh. He has been a very good friend of mine. I have known him for I think half a decade now, and he has worked in a variety of fields in consultancy, management, training. He's currently director in We Lead, uh, which is part of Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement in Mysore. And he's a voracious reader. He writes on various issues like politics, spirituality, and he's currently last for the last 4 months he's doing a Vishnu Sahasranama marathon, so to speak, wherein every day he writes a commentary on one name of Bhagavan Vishnu, and he has been doing this without a break for the last 3-4 months. I think he finished 108 names day before yesterday. Ramesh, once again, welcome on our show. We are very happy to have you. And viewers, please post your questions in question and answer box and not in the chat box. And Ramesh will take up these questions towards the end of the session. To just give a brief, yesterday he spoke about kind of a background to Vishnu Sahasranama, the the context wherein the Bhishma gives Vishnu Sahasranama to Yudhishthira. I think today Ramesh will take up some of the names, some of the interesting names, and shed more light on them. I have a very warm welcome to everyone once again, and I request Ramesh to start his session.
Thank you, Nitin, and once again, thank you to all the participants who have come back again. It's not easy given that we are speaking for 8 hours, and we've already been through 4 hours of the session, and we'd like to start with a small prayer. Om Gananaham Tva Ganapati Gum Havamahe Kavin Kavina Mupamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspata Anashunvan Nutibisi Rasadanam Sriman Mahaganadipataye Namaha. There is a small shloka that also I would like to recite, which is Akashat Patitam Toyam Yada Gacchati Sagaram Sarvadeva Namaskaram Keshavam Prati Gacchati, which is the which comes in the Sandhya Vandanam, is also reflective of who Vishnu is, because it says just as the water from the rain somehow makes its way back to the ocean through the rivers and through the rivulets and the streams, so also no matter whom we pray to whichever deva we pray to, all of the prayers actually go back to Vishnu. I think Nitin has already done a small, short summary of yesterday's sessions, but I'll quickly run through that for the benefit of those who had attended yesterday, and also for those who are new to the session today. Yesterday, we both morning and evening, we focused on where the Vishnu Sahasranama is actually embedded within the Mahabharata. Then we looked at why the Vishnu Sahasranama is the Sahasranama of all Sahasranamas. That is, when you say Sahasranama, we discussed why you don't have to add a prefix to only this Sahasranama. Other Sahasranamas, we have to say Lalita Sahasranama or Shiva Sahasranama and all of the those things. But here we don't have to say. When you say Sahasranama, it is taken for granted that it actually talks about the Vishnu Sahasranama. Then we looked at the context and the a short prelude to where this Sahasranama occurs. And then we also looked at why Bhishma is chosen and why he is made the Kshetrajna. And we saw that the Kshetrajna refers to somebody who is a knower of the field. So during the Mahabharata Kurukshetra war, Krishna was the Kshetrajna because he alone knew the field. It was his, in a sense, choreography that ensured that, all the warriors of Dharma landed up on that Dharma Kshetra. That is why it's called Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre. And then they, and therefore, during the entire transmission of the Bhagavad Gita, we saw how it was Krishna alone who was the Kshetrajna. And the Kshetrajna also means the, indwelling Atman. And in that sense, the Kshetra becomes the body. And we have also seen that how in the Hindu context, many of our, Kshetra also means sacred geography. For example, Ayodhya is sacred geography. It's a Kshetra. That is why, for more than 500 years, we continued to fight, because it did not just mean a temple, which is how the, discourse is made, but it also meant that we had to get back that Kshetra which is sacred to us. So also is, Kurukshetra or Tirumala, for example. That is something that we saw. Then we looked at the 6 questions that, Yudhishthira frames, and how carefully they are framed in terms of not just probing, but also, how we connected it to beginning with the end in mind, and then going on to list what are the questions. Then we looked at how Bhishma responded to that, not necessarily in the order of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but how he chose to answer it, in a slightly different way, where he looked at 6, 4, 3, 2, and that kind of, where he did not answer it in a serial order, again for a specific reason, because he wanted to, show the destination first. He said, if you have to get there, which is how the management principle is talked about. First, find out where you need to get, what is the destination you need to get to, and then decide on the path that needs to be taken. And then he gives the path, and then he decides. Then he says that the path is Vishnu Sahasranama. Then we look at, then we also looked at why Vishnu Sahasranama is equated with to the Vedas. Why? Because, and then we gave we talked about how Shankara mentions that, Parashara Bhatta mentions that, Krishna himself mentions that, Bhishma mentions that, and all of these things. And finally, we looked at very briefly at how Vishnu should be first installed in the heart space. Specifically, a question that was asked, why don't we simply only chant the Vishnu Sahasranama? But it also helps to, for the entire force of the this one to descend. We also need to ensure that we establish Vishnu in the heart center and Krishna in the Nabi Kamala, the Nabi center. So this was broadly what we discussed. And today, at random, I want to pick up a few names that look different. And I will also be discussing how Shankara, or because most of it is only 1 or 2 lines, how Shankara and Parashara Bhattar have looked at this name, and also why, if I have looked at it differently, why, and also the fact that from each of these names, I've also appended certain stories or anecdotes which I thought was relevant. And sometimes I've chosen to, for example, also chosen to go with Shankara, sometimes with Parashara Bhattar, based on a variety of factors, including my own intuition, and also, but more specifically, with regard to how the name appears within the string and how that is connected. So that is what we look at. Yesterday, I received a lot of messages and also some emails asking for, recommendations for books. So I will take 5 minutes to show some of the books. I think most of the questions focused on what books to read to get to know Vishnu better, and also what for Vishnu Sahasranama. I'll start with Vishnu Sahasranama. 2 very simple books that I mentioned this book, and uh, the this is the small Vishnu Sahasranama book that is published by the Ramakrishna Mutt, and so it's easily available. And so this is this is the book, and it comes with a commentary by Swami Tapasyananda. Then I mentioned the book that is written by P. Shankara Narayanan, and also the which is this, which is published by the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. So this is also a good reference for the Vishnu Sahasranama. And also, to have an alternative, view of the Vishnu Sahasranama, the book written by Sri Parashara Bhattar, which gives the which is written from the Vishishta Advaita viewpoint. That book is available, and so it is called Bhagavat Guna Darpana, which means that it looks at the gunas of Bhagavan. So that is one. And specifically about Vishnu, I would quickly recommend this book, which is the we spoke about it. It's the Srimad Bhagavatam. It comes in 4 volumes. Again, translated by Swami Tapasyananda and published by the Ramakrishna Mutt. It comes in 4 volumes. I like this book because it's a very, very faithful translation of each of the it's a very faithful translation of the entire Srimad Bhagavatam with English translations and transliterations. If you want to read more of a story kind of a thing, I also think again Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan published a book of Srimad Bhagavatam written by Srimati Kamala Subramaniam. This also is a good reference book that can be read. And one of all the commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, because the Bhagavad Gita is very, very closely related to the Vishnu Sahasranama. One of the commentaries that I always recommend, and I think is probably the one commentary, because most commentaries look at the Bhagavad Gita and translate it verse to verse, or translate it from word to word, or give their own import and purport about it. But I prefer something like this, which makes you think. Again, this is by Swami Swarupananda. This is a simple translation, just the verse, so it makes you think. So this is one book where you can actually understand how Vishnu functions when you read the Gita. And the second one, I don't know if it's visible here, which I actually think is very good, is the essays on the Gita by Sri Aurobindo. I think this is the most different take that anybody has on the Gita, where he talks about it very, very differently, and this one, and it gives you a viewpoint that is completely different from many of the viewpoints that are extant and prevalent across the world. So that is shortly wanted to cover all of this, and this one. So we will so today, as we discussed, we look at some of the names, and why I take the approach that I have taken. So essentially it will be that we will look at look at the names that I have selected at random, and then even as we see it, I will also read out from how I have seen it and what I have written about it. I had posted the link to the blog yesterday in the chat box. I'll do that again today. So in that sense, you will be able, you can not only read all of the names, since we may not be able, but I think we will not be able to cover all of the names during today's discussion, and therefore you can follow it. I hope the screen is visible to all.
You put it in a slideshow mode.
I'll do that. Yeah. So the first name that I have chosen is called Vyalaha. Now Vyalaha is is name number 92 in the series that comes, and I will given here how each of the how both the acharyas have approached this particular name, Vyalaha. So he says Vyalaha refers to a serpent, like something like so Shankara talks about it as he who cannot be easily grasped and is as elusive and slippery as a serpent. And he also mentions that he is difficult to hold on to, like a rogue elephant. I mean you can see that how difficult he is. That essentially, most people, if you discuss the the aspect of Vishnu and also Krishna for that matter, they will typically tell you that Krishna is not somebody who can while you just have to give me a minute, because I think I'm not plugged in my computer. I'll just do that, and just give me a minute. Yeah, sorry about that. I think I don't want the the battery to drain away, and then we do. So if you look at like I said, they typically talk about how it's not at all easy for people to grasp that Vishnu. For example, but you will also read that, he is somebody who is approachable, who's very compassionate. Most people, if you look at the history of devotion to Vishnu, you will find that he's easily, which is all true. He's easily approachable. He's accessible. Of all the deities, of all the devas, he's one who is easily approachable, which is true. But at the same time, it's also true that the moment some sort of thought enters your mind or enters somebody's mind that you have complete control over him or others, he tends to disappear away. There was a question that was asked about uh, how does one get out of this whole business of, how is it possible for us to ensure that our chanting or our prayers are not mechanical? And I did respond saying that it's a problem that everybody encounters, and as Aurobindo himself points out, the initial stages, there is a lot of determination, and things seem to, but typically every movement along this path is typically exactly like this. If you read the stories of every single a saint or person, or everybody who has stepped onto this path. And I also mentioned that everybody will step onto the path, if not today, at some point in their lives, if not in this life, at least in the next life, because that is the whole the nature of how mm, the cycle of birth, death, and birth, death, birth cycle works. That you gradually are turned around in the wheel of life, and then you get to the stage where you start understanding and move towards the center. So which is what this. But if you look at how Parashara Bhattar sees it, because Parashara Bhattar is approaching it, and in the Advaita Vedanta, you will typically see that uh, you will see the analogy used of a rope, that the rope is mistaken for a serpent and all of that. So it comes from that, where he's looking at this one as, and he's quite right in saying that he's as slippery and as elusive as a serpent, and it's difficult to hold on to. It needs constant effort. And sometimes, as I said, the initial the stages are very easy. Then you get through a stage where everything is dark, and you don't know where you're going, you don't know what you're doing, and nothing seems to be working, and you're simply putting in mechanical effort on that path. But that is a stage that everybody goes through. And the only assurance is that if you read all of the scriptures that are available on this, they tell you that there is definitely light at the end of the tunnel, provided you're willing to walk the entire distance length of the tunnel, and then get to that light. Because then again there will be another this one where, because these are like Aurobindo mentioned, these are layers, and it's like peeling the onion, which is also a management concept, that you need to keep peeling the outer layers of the onion to get to the core of that. And it's not easy, your eyes water, it's very difficult to do it, but they need to be peeled. And there are going to be periods when it appears that nothing is happening, but you have to go with the assurance that things are still moving even if they appear stationary. So that is the nature of this. Whereas Parashara Bhattar approaches it from, because for him it is also always Saushilyam and Saulabatvam. That it cannot happen. He cannot see this one, because he's considered the very son of of Vishnu himself, Vishnu's beloved son. So therefore, for him, this whole concept doesn't he doesn't even see that, because he's gifted in that sense, that he's already bestowed, it's already bestowed on him, that Vishnu has already accepted him. And therefore he says, he who accepts and protects his devotees, which is also true. Vishnu does accept and protect his devotees, but at the same time, even as I said, at the initial stages, it's very easy. He accepts and all of that. He can become, he is, and he will. Everybody goes through a phase, and which is what Shankara is referring to. And also Shankara comes to this from a this one. And even the most ardent of devotees go through this. So now I just read from what I wrote, because so like I said very briefly. So for some it will be a repetition, but typically what I do is I take a name, read it like this, and then mull over it for the entire day, so that I get to see how this name can be interpreted, so that it makes sense first to myself. So because it needs to make sense, because you also need to, and in order for something to make sense, you need to connect it to multiple things that you are that is how learning itself happens. You need to connect it to something. Even the learning that we do in school, college, or even within our jobs, on the jobs that we do, is that when you connect it to things that you know about, and then you start relating to other things or to stories that you know, and then you do it. So that is exactly how it. And then the I'll start reading. So it just says, so Vyalaha, while it is true that Vishnu is compassionate and all embracing and accepting of his devotees, it is also true that he is very demanding and extremely difficult to hold on to, as this name suggests. Just as when Vishnu became Mohini and kept slipping out of the grasp of the Asuras, while at the same time, it is also true that few can stay away from the Akarshana of Vishnu or Krishna. Now, the very name Krishna is a play upon the word Akarshana, that he is by very nature attractive. Everybody, he's like a magnet that pulls. And that is why Parashara Bhattar says, he who accepts and protects his devotees, that is not wrong. But at the same time, the moment Ramakrishna gives Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa gives a very great analogy for this. He says that the moment, as long as the needle is kept clean, it sticks to the magnet. But just dip it into some uh, cover it up with some dirt or cover it up, and then you find that the magnet no longer attracts it. That's exactly what happens, that he can slip away from our grasp. So we continue to read. The greatest example of this Akarshana is the Rasa Leela episodes of the Srimad Bhagavatam. The gopis are known to have the greatest, in Vishnu Sahasranama, Shankara says the bhakti that needs to come, or what Parashara Bhattar actually says also, is that the bhakti that needs to be done, it should be the kind of bhakti that the gopikas had for Krishna. It was rati, which is Shringara, and also almost bordering on, for lack of a better English word, on lust itself. But that is what it is. But it is lust consummated in the grandness of things, in which what they saw in Krishna. So that is how it is. And he says the greatest example of this, I read again, the greatest example of this Akarshana is the Rasa Leela episodes of the Srimad Bhagavatam, where the gopis are so immersed and completely identified with Krishna that they can't bear his separation even for a moment, and run around searching for him like mad women, asking the trees and the leaves about his whereabouts. It is said that they were like love-lorn cow elephants who had lost their lead tusker. But then the question is, then why did Krishna, who was always with them, suddenly disappear? He disappeared as soon as pride, possessiveness, and self-importance entered the hearts of the gopis. And he is like that, all attractiveness and compassion, but still slippery. He will give all, but also take all. That is, that's the kind of relationship. That is Vishnu, and therefore he is Vyalaha. And this is how I've interpreted it. And then I go on to say that, reproduced below are excerpts from the Srimad Bhagavatam that capture the mood of the gopis when they realize that their Krishna has disappeared from their midst. And this is how it feels to be disconnected from the one who is the indweller in all beings. Not for everybody, because most of us are disconnected from the dynamo that charges us and recharges us on a daily basis, to use the analogy of how the battery, the mobile phones work. But it is the dynamo, it is that. But once even a tiny connection is established, however small, however little that connection is, even a small disconnection from that connection tends to throw you into throw people out of their normal behavior. And this is how it feels to be disconnected from the one who is the indweller in all beings. It is rasa because it is the purest essence of all essences, the ultimate consummation of the Atman in the Paramatma. And now I'll read out from how Swami Tapasyananda translates the Srimad Bhagavata, and you will see the connection here. The gopis, on noticing that Krishna had suddenly vanished from their midst, became distressed as the cow elephants in a herd would be when their leading tusker is gone. These women, their minds powerfully attracted and fully absorbed in the varied activities of the Lord, His gait, His love, His attractive conversation, and His various sportive activities, felt a sense of identification with Him and started to assume His ways and attitudes. Those beloved ladies of Krishna felt so attracted that they felt themselves to be one with him and imitated his sportive ways and declared themselves to be Krishna. Singing loudly, they moved from forest to forest in a body in search of Krishna like demented persons. They inquired of forest trees the whereabouts of that all pervading being who is within and without of all entities, like the unseen Akasha. Speaking thus in the fashion of demented persons and engaged in an exhausting search for Krishna, the gopis got so much more identified in that consciousness that he is and with him that they began to enact the various sportive performances of his infancy. One woman acted as Putana, while another, taking the role of Krishna, suckled at her breasts. Another, impersonating the crying infant Krishna, kicked the one who played the part of the cart. Identifying herself with the wind demon, one gopi carried away another, standing for Krishna. Still another began to move about like the baby Krishna on knees and hands, filling the space with a murmur of mini bells on girdles and anklets. Two of them impersonated Rama and Krishna. The reference is to Balarama. And some others, the cowherd boys and the calves of the cows. Enacting the sports of Krishna, one got killed as Vatsasura and another as Bakasura. This is the swan Bakasura, not the one that Bhima killed. One impersonating Krishna called back from a distance the cattle that had strayed away. One played on the flute and frolicked, while others watched the play and cried out in appreciation. In complete identification with Krishna, one put her hand on the shoulder of another and walked about saying, I am Krishna, see my charming gait. Do not have any fear of wind and rain, I give you protection from it. So saying, one woman lifted up her upper garment with great effort, as if she was holding aloft the Govardhana mountain. Another, in identification of the Kalia episode, got on the head of another and said, O evil one, go away from here. I am born to punish the wicked, and I shall give you relief, and that too immediately. And there is much more as part of the episode, but it shows what it means to be in the coils of that Vyala, that serpent, and what it means to lose him. There is not a line here that I can write or read without my eyes blurring and shivers running down my body. I write. Such is the purity and essence of the bhakti of the gopis. And even from them, Krishna could slip away. Because the moment, possessiveness, pride, and all of that entered. So this is taken from the book that I showed, Swami Tapasyananda's translation. And this is one of the reasons I recommend it, because it's one of the most magical translations of this one. And without adding a word or subtracting anything, he translates it word for word. And then the absolute flow with which the book reads. And it's available as 4 volumes in any of the Ramakrishna Mutt shops. If you want to actually understand what Vishnu is or Krishna, because Krishna is Vishnu. I mean, Krishna is synonymous with Vishnu, and therefore, it's we can look at that as that book. So this is Vyalaha, one of the names that we looked at, and rather how I reflected upon it. The second name that I've chosen for today, and we'll choose few more in the evening session, is Sharanam. Both Shankara and Parashara Bhattar look at it in the same way. I mentioned yesterday, I think Nitin posed that question, how do they, I think 80 to 85% of the names, both of them see it exactly the same. But there are instances where they differ. We saw the earlier name, Vyalaha, where they differed. Primarily because, Shankara always focuses on the Paratattvam and Aishwaryam of Vishnu, whereas, Parashara Bhattar looks at the Saushilyam and the Saulabatvam of Vishnu. So both of them say he who is the refuge of all, the abode and home of all, he who is the protector and the final resting place. This is an answer to that question also. What is the destination? And Parashara Bhattar further adds, Narayana is the abode, the refuge, the friend, and the goal of attainment. This is a Bhakta speaking. So he says Narayana is the abode, the refuge, the friend, and the goal of attainment. I would also call everybody's attention to the picture, because if you look at the Gada that is there, Gada is the mace that is there here. This is exactly how the Gada has to be shown. If you look at the old stone sculptures, if you look at many of the stone sculptures, this is how it will be. But nowadays, because of the popular culture that is propagated in movies and also in certain comics and other things, you will find that most Gadas look like lollipops with a small stick that holds a large uh, ball at the end of it. That is not how that Gada never functioned like that. It was a blunt instrument, and it caused trauma when it was used, and Vishnu uses it to shatter delusion and illusion, and also to shatter the skulls of asuras. So in that sense, this is how a skull, because if you had something as as a small stick and that large globe at the end of the stick, the moment you hit it, the globe would drop off the stick, and it wouldn't last. So it's a club, as opposed to that one that is used in most of it. So this is so that is another point that I wanted to bring out here. So this is how a Gada should be depicted, and it's called the Kaumodaki, the Gada of Vishnu. So like I said, Sharanam. So this is Sharanam. So he is the refuge. So I'll read from how I've reflected on Sharanam and what it means. So I read in interpreting the previous name, a Sanskrit shloka, which is Suresha Sharanam. So Suresha was the previous name. In interpreting the previous name, a Sanskrit shloka that is part of the Sandhya Vandana was referred to in the context of all worship to any divinity, leading to that one supreme being as seen in the following verses. This is something or rather anybody who does Sandhya Vandana, which is enjoined and prescribed for everybody to do, at least for the people who are belonging to the three varnas. And it says, Akashat patitam toyam yada gacchati sagaram sarvadeva namaskaram keshavam prati gacchati. So just as the rain that falls from the sky always winds its way to the ocean, so also worship of any divinity ultimately reaches that one supreme being, Keshava. You can worship anyone, there's nothing wrong, but all of the all that you offer, all that you give, actually reaches the one supreme being who is being referred to here. And the question that Yudhishthira asked also was that who is that supreme being, who is the final abode and refuge, and who should be worshipped. And therefore this is also in that sense a response to that question of Yudhishthira as well. So and again the reference is to Keshava, which is one of the commonest names used for Krishna, the one with beautiful hair, curly locks that he had. And again, reading from what I have written, what we see here in this name, Sharanam, that dovetails perfectly with the previous name, Suresha, is that no matter where we go, how long we travel, we finally have to come to rest within the folds of that one supreme being. His Sharanam is the final resting place for all, the harbor where every boat must drop anchor. It is not now, if not now, then at some time. If not this birth, then perhaps after 1,000, but every single being must go back to its source and merge in that eternal being. Just as Brahma seemed lost when the lotus stalk with him, seated on the lotus, emerged out of the cosmic waters, and he looked in all four directions, and hence he became Brahma of the four faces. And as he looked in all four directions, trying to locate himself, in the vastness of that eternity, so are we, boats sailing on the water, not knowing where to drop anchor. And then Brahma then had to meditate for several thousand years, and then finally he realized that he had to climb down the lotus stalk to find his source, the anchor of the entire universe, Vishnu, who is called Sharanam. That's how I've looked at it. It's not something that you'll find in the commentaries of either Shankara or Parashara. It's something that I have used to use as a reference point, and also to build on how I want to relate to this name. So this is the story, this is that appears in both the Srimad Bhagavatam and very beautifully depicted in the Narayaniyam, where Brahma is sitting on the lotus stalk, and he doesn't and as soon as he opens his eyes, he looks all around, and they say, because he looked in all the four directions and found nothing but expansive space and nothing more. That is the meaning of the four faces that are depicted, one of the ways in which it is seen. And Sharanam is 86, Padmavati. Yeah. So I think there's a chat which I answered. This is like I said, just as this he looked up, and then he saw the four faces. That is why he's shown as one with four faces, the anchor of the entire universe. And this is how I read it. And then he says, and then I continue reading. This is the same principle that we see in our temples, where we need to go to the Garbhagriha to find the source and enter into the deity's Sharan, benevolent protection. That's exactly how the temple, just as yesterday we saw that for the Vishnu Sahasranama, our own body is the temple, and with Vyasa installed on the head as the Guru, Vishnu installed in the heart space, and therefore the Garbhagriha, literally, and Krishna, the Shakti that animates the entire stotram, in the Nabhi Kamala, the navel, because every word actually, if you look at it, emanates from the navel region, and therefore it is Krishna alone who in a sense was part of was the one who actually spoke about it through the agency of by Bhishma. So this is the same, I continue to read, this is the same principle that we see in our temples, where we need to go to the Garbhagriha to find the source and enter into the deity's Sharan, or the benevolent protection. Everything that is done, the waving of the lamps, the fragrance of the dhupam, the light of the deepam, the beauty of the abhisheka or the alankara, the screen that is removed suddenly to reveal the deity in all its glory, all of these are specifically done to bring our whole body-mind complex into that perfect state of rhythm. Rhythm is a Sanskrit word, harmony and truth, such that we can at least for a moment be given an opportunity to stand on the shores of that infinite ocean. Sri Aurobindo, in his Secret of the Vedas, and this is another book that I strongly recommend that everybody reads, because too often, today what has happened is, Vedas is about chanting, and Veda is for the Purohit, and Vedanta is for the sannyasis, the standard, thing. But for a long time, what has happened is, because it was essentially only the Westerners who translated the Vedas for us, we seem to have lost what was the eternal secret that was embedded in the Vedas. I'm not going to go into it, but I would recommend that everybody actually reads Aurobindo's The Secret of the Vedas, where he lays out in beautiful prose, and it's not easy to read Aurobindo, and so it requires that you spend a lot of time with paper and pencil and highlighter before you can actually read The Secret of the Vedas. But it'll be time well spent, because he mentions that he talks about three Vedic principles, Satyam, Ritam, Brihat, as the fundamental pillars of the Vedas. Nowhere will you see dharma being mentioned. Today, everybody talks about Sanatana Dharma. He says Satyam, Ritam, Brihat as the fundamental pillars of the Vedas and key to human growth on the spiritual plane. And he further posits that it is rhythm that was later codified into dharma, because rhythm essentially meant that you had to bring your physical the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual, as well as your all of your conscious, superconscious beings into one, into harmony for any for anything to for, and that is what he meant by rhythm. Interestingly, you will find that it is rhythm that is the root for many words and practices of our dharma. There is the word called ritu, which is seasons. They, during these seasons, they will tell you, you must eat this, you must wear this kind of a dress, you must do this, these practices. So ritu comes from rhythm. Vratam, ekadasi vratam, sankashtahara chaturthi vratam. This also derives from the root word of rhythm, which means that you bring your life into a certain rhythm. And I also posit, and just as there are so many English words that are borrowed from Sanskrit, the word English rhythm is also derived from this, as is the English word ritual, which is codified practice of certain things, is also derived from this very same Sanskrit root, which is rhythm. It is this rhythm that is codified as dharma, and the dharma samskaras that we are enjoined to do are also for the purpose of bringing ourselves to that state of rhythm. Yesterday also, there were questions: should we do only this? Should we do only that? That is a choice that we individually have to make, but that is a choice that you make in the full knowledge that by dropping something, you also run the risk of not bringing your system into that state of absolute rhythm. Literally, I'm using the English word rhythm here, such that uh, the music of the divine and the music that plays within you are in sync. So that is the essential reason why the samskaras are there. The sometimes the what seems crazy, sometimes what seems so difficult to do, is essentially a habit and routine that needs to be built into our system to ensure that and we also know that as soon as you reach that stage, everything else drops. The sannyasi is not enjoined to do any of these things, because he's crossed over to the other side. So, or even the Jivan Mukta is not the one who is liberated even in life, even while living. He's not enjoined to do any of those things. If he does it because he wants to do it. For example, I'll talk about the Kanchi Paramacharya himself, whom I keep referring to. He says, when somebody asked, you already crossed over to the other side, why do you keep doing this? He says, no, I might have crossed over to the other side, I might know all of these things, but please understand that if I'm still the Matadipati, and therefore there are certain rules that I have to follow. There is a dharma for the Matadipati which I cannot give up just because I've crossed over. And if I was like my brother Venkatraman, he says, which is Ramana Maharshi, whom he refers to, I would gladly, live like him, but I can't, because in this birth I have been asked to take care of this mata. So that's what he says. So that is the whole purpose. I know there is a little bit of digression, but I also want to, this whole idea is that this is a reflective session. Therefore, I assume that the digressions are acceptable and are adding value to this session. I'm assuming that is true. If not, I think I'm glad to change and just read and do it. And it is this rhythm that is codified as dharma, and dharmas and the dharma samskaras that we are enjoined to do are also for the purpose of bringing ourselves to that state of rhythm. For without that, how can we hope to come into his sharan? How can we hope to come into the benevolent sharan of that person? It is this that should give us the confidence that nothing that is included in our dharma is included without a clear objective. The results, of course, depend on the seeker and the intensity of the seeking for the sharan of that sharanam. Therefore, the stage that you reach is completely dependent on your intensity, how much effort you bring in, what you do. But it is, there are, in fact, there are 4 instances in the Bhagavad Gita itself across chapters, 2 to 9 in the Bhagavad Gita, where Bhagavan asks Arjuna to give up everything and come into Sharan. This giving up is often interpreted as, that, so give up everything. And, but it is not a call to give up the principles of Dharma. How could he who asked Arjuna to follow his dharma, say something to contradictory. If you look at some of the translations, the modern translations, or some of the literature that where they have mined the principles of the Gita and published it into marketing jargon or management principles, you will find that they will use it very conveniently. That for example, the shloka, the verse where he says, you have the right to the, you don't have the right to work, you just have to do your work, discharge your duties and all. But it's not duties in that sense. It is not disinterested work, and it is not work as Aurobindo himself points out. It is not work as we see it. It is not the work that you do in your office. It is the work that you do on your own self, for your change, for the self, for the change that you bring yourself. That is the work that he's referring to. How will you work on your own self? Today the leadership principles, leadership books talks about the self and the other, understanding your own self, understanding the other, relating to the self. But if you see, the greatest mentor was Krishna and his mentee was Arjuna, and he was actually delineating the leadership principles right there. And most of the but we are taken in by Leibniz and all of these leadership gurus who write because they are connected to Harvard or to other business schools. But if you will actually see that if you, many of these things are principles that are already embedded into the dharma itself. So in that sense, when he says giving up, it does not mean giving up everything, which is how normally, for our convenience, most people do it. And it's also not disinterested work in the office. Even that is not what he's saying. He's saying, when he says give up everything and work, he's saying work on yourself. That's how it's understood. Whereas we interpret it as doing work just for the sake of doing some work. No, it is instead an injunction to give up wasteful indulgences and frittering away time and energy in meaningless arguments and rhetoric, and come on to the path that lead our individual boats to the harbor of that supreme being, in order to come into the sharan of that sharanam. So this is how I have looked at this one. Are there any questions or anything, or should I?
No, you go ahead, Ramesh.
Yeah.
You take up question at the end.
Yeah,
Viewers,
yeah.
please post your questions in Q&A. Ramesh will take up towards the end.
Yeah, with the disclaimer that I hopefully if I know the answers. So,
You should tell the viewers that you will also be bringing out your own commentary on Vishnu Sahasranama eventually.
because most of I think what Nitin is jogging my memory. I think what will happen is that all of these blogs, all of these articles, I'm looking at hitting 250. That is also a recommendation that Nitin makes. When I hit 250, I'll probably be bringing out the first volume of the, because I think the because my commentaries are very long, that itself will run into several hundred pages. And I'll also be including the entire prelude that we discussed yesterday with added things. So once I hit 250, which is about, say, another 2-3 months down the road, I should be publishing the first of the volumes. I think that is something. Thanks, Nitin. Yeah. The next name that I've chosen is Suresha. It's a very, very common name, and essentially means he who is the master of the suras. And sura is distinguished from the asura, and these are the devas. And many asuras and suras live amongst us, and many of us ourselves, at times we are possessed by the asura within, and we behave in that sense also, if you look at it. And therefore he who is the master of the suras, that is the devas. And sometimes when the like Aurobindo says, when the word of the Lord is aboard on the waters, we also behave like devas. And therefore he who is the best among those who can fulfill the wishes of the devotees. This is Shankara. Parashara is not very different, but he also adds, he says he's Suresha because it is he who confers on all the devas, including Brahma and Rudra, their respective roles. I mean, he's very clear. He uses the word role. In fact, so when we talk about management, when we talk principles, we talk about role clarity. So here we have role clarity coming out very clearly. This is your role. And look at how each person, even if you look at the multiple deities that you have, you will find clearly Shanmuka's role is to command the armies. And so also, and many, you look at each of this. So there is absolute role clarity. There is Shiva will look at this, Brahma will look at that, Vishnu will organize things. So it is very, very clear, absolute role clarity. So as I keep saying, most of, the more you delve into the ocean that is the dharma, you will realize that so much of what we see in the literature that is published by the West, and this is not this is not something that I'm venting out on what they have done. I think in this present age and day they have gone far ahead of us, and we have lost out on where we were in terms of and what we could have done, and we continue to lose out on many things. But the point is that a lot of these things did exist, and that is all that I'm trying to bring. This is not an attempt to belittle what the West has done. I think they've done tremendously well in many of the things they're doing right now, and that is also needs to be acknowledged. So he's Suresha because it is he who confers, and he's the master of the Suras or the Devas. So and I'll read from what I write, and he said, and I write, the word Suresha is a compound word that combines two words, Sura and Isha, meaning the master of the gods, i.e., the Devas. The opposite and sworn enemies are, of course, the Asuras. Who really are the Devas and who really are the Asuras is a question that I ask myself as I write. In chapter 9, verses 23 and 25 of the Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavan, and as I mentioned yesterday, nowhere is he called Krishna. So we will continue. Every time he speaks, he is referred to as Bhagavan Uvacha. So Bhagavan makes a mention of the Devas. Verse 23 talks about what the gunas are, what the Devas, in chapter 9, that is. And anybody can take up the Bhagavad Gita book and look at it. Chapter 9, verses 23 and 25. Who are the Devas and verses. These two verses, and I continue to write, and I'll focus on the reflection alone. These two verses are interpreted by most commentators as Bhagavan Krishna, meaning to say that even those who worship other Devas and gods also in reality worship only me, and those who worship the lesser gods and beings go to them, and those who worship me come to me. That is verse 25. So verse 23 says, this is how normally the commentary is interpreted. That is, these two verses, 23 is interpreted as those who worship other devas and gods also in reality worship only me. We saw that Akashat Patitam Toyam Yada Gacchati Sagaram, and they ultimately come to me. But those who worship the lesser gods and beings go to them. So, and those who worship only come to me. While technically, which is typically how most Bhagavad Gita translations happen, and that is why I don't, I prefer to read the raw bone, the verses, where I read the verses and I have an opportunity where my mind is not shaped by what the other person is thinking, and therefore I can think myself, and which may be good, may not be good, but that is exactly how I like to approach every book. With the exception of a few people where I like to where I learn from how they think, and that includes Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda, because the kind of lateral thinking, which is also a famous management jargon that both Aurobindo and Vivekananda showed, is not something I think that anybody has the capacity to think on those terms. So even lateral thinking, for that matter, comes from the expansive thinking that Aurobindo and Vivekananda, to cite just two examples of how they brought thinking. But what Bhagavan, as I see it, is actually talking about is the fact that we can do all we want in pursuit of material benefits. But if you really want to understand who you really are, again, I say that material comfort is not bad, but it should not become the summum bonum of our existence, not the be all and end all of how we want to see it. So whereas as long as the loss of something material or the gain of something material does not change your fundamental value system, to use a modern jargon again, then you're okay. So he's actually talking about the fact that we can do all we want in pursuit of material benefits, but if you really want to understand who you really are and what your real goal in life is, and actually break the birth cycle, then you must turn your gaze inward. and realize the indwelling Krishna, who is the one who has become the many, and the one reality that both pervades and interpenetrates every being and also everything in the universe, animate and inanimate, and therefore worship him who is the one Suresha, to whom even the gods, including Brahma, finally go to. At the at Pralaya, all of them disappear into the nothingness of, or you want to call it nothingness, or the everythingness of Vishnu. Krishna is saying that people, depending on their gunas, that is tendencies, which is essentially, how people tend to behave, how they bend, go around, but finally they have to come to me. He's not saying that those who go to others go to them. Essentially, what he means is they can do a lot of things. They can go around, and that's perfectly fine. They have the freedom to do that. But please understand that they all come back to me. They will come onto this path, and therefore and in Vivekananda also says, therefore come onto the path early. Why go around? Go around, because invariably you need to come here, and tendencies go around, but finally they have to come to me, the last and sole refuge of all. And then again, the Sandhyavandana shloka, which I have repeated, so I'll not repeat that here. And and you also have that shloka, Shuklam Baradaram Vishnum Sashivarnam, and all that, which essentially means, I mentioned it yesterday, so I'll not read it out again, which essentially says that that serene personality reclining on that ancient serpent, Adisesha, he whose navel holds the lotus of creation. I mean, the lotus of creation is subsumed within the uh, body of that person. That person is Suresha. So the serene personality reclining on that ancient serpent is how I see it. And he whose navel holds the lotus of creation itself should clearly be the Suresha. And it also answers Yudhishthira's question about who is that person whom I need to reach to. Uh, I'll also read out from Aurobindo's book, Essays on the Gita, even if this takes time. And as I mentioned, uh, I think everybody needs to make an investment in buying this, because it will blow your mind in terms of what actually is the Bhagavad Gita, because Aurobindo approaches it in a matter that in a matter and form that no one before has approached it. And like I said, it's a difficult book to read, but every single minute that you spend reading it is worth that minute, is worth its weight in gold. And I quote, and I also included in the blog, that our ordinary turn is actually towards making our reason and will the servants of our rajasic or tamasic egoism, the ministers of our restless and ill-balanced kinetic desire, or our self-indulgent indolence and static inertia, can only be, one would imagine, a temporary characteristic of our undeveloped spiritual being, a rawness of its imperfect evolution, and must disappear when our consciousness rises in the spiritual scale. But we actually see that men, at least men above a certain level, fall very largely into two classes: those who have a dominant force of sattvic nature turned towards knowledge, self control, perfection, beneficence, and those who have a dominant force of rajasic nature. This is the second type of people he's referring to, turn towards egoistic greatness, satisfaction of desire, the indulgence of their own strong will and personality, which they seek to impose on the world, not for the service of man or God, but for their own pride, glory, and pleasure. That is how he defines the Deva versus the Asura. These are the human representatives of the Devas and Danavas or Asuras, the gods and the titans. This distinction is a very ancient one in Indian religious symbolism. The fundamental idea of the Rig Veda is a struggle between the gods and their dark opponents, between the masters of light, sons of infinity, and the children of division and night, a battle in which man takes part and which is reflected in all his inner life and action. The same idea is prominent in later literature as well. Aurobindo goes on to say the Ramayana is, in its ethical intention, the parable of an enormous conflict between that Deva in human form and the incarnate Rakshasa, between the representative of high culture and dharma and a huge unbridled force and gigantic civilization of the exaggerated ego. The Mahabharata, of which Gita is a section, takes for its subject a lifelong clash between humans, devas, and asuras. The men of power, sons of the gods, who are governed by the light of a high ethical dharma, and others who are embodied titans, the Rakshasas, Asuras, the men of power who are out for the service of their intellectual, vital, and physical ego alone. The ancient mind, more open than ours to the truth of things behind the physical veil, saw behind the life of man great cosmic powers of beings, representative of certain turns or grades of the universal Shakti, divine, titanic, gigantic, demoniac, and men who strongly represented in themselves these types of nature were themselves considered as devas, asuras, rakshasas, pisachas. The Gita, for its own purposes, takes up this distinction and develops the difference between these two kinds of beings. And I'll not read the whole thing. So I think, like I said, please go ahead, go and buy that book if you don't buy any other book as well. And he further says the distinction between the Deva and the Asura is not comprehensive of all humanity, not rigidly applicable to all its individuals, neither is it sharp and definite in all stages of the moral or spiritual history of the race, or in all phases of the individual evolution. And he further goes on, he says, on one side there can be a sublimate, for here what is in question is a certain culmination in the evolution of the qualitative nature, as will be evident from the descriptions given in the Gita. On one side there can be a sublimation of the sattvic quality, the culmination or manifestation of the unborn Deva, or on the other side a sublimation of the rajasic nature and the turn of the soul in nature, the entire birth of the Asura. The one leads towards that movement of liberation on which the Gita is about to lay stress. It makes possible a high self exceeding of the sattva quality and a transformation into the likeness of the divine, that we also become like the divine. And that is why we worship, people like Ramakrishna Paramahamsa or Aurobindo or Ramana. The other, which is the Asura way, leads away from that universal potentiality and precipitates towards an exaggeration of all that is evil. So this is this one. You can catch the entire this one on the blog. Yeah, thank you. I think it's the secret of the Vedas. The name, I think there was a question that somebody wrote back, so I included this name for today, which is Samvatsaraha, which essentially is Kala. So the entire thing is taken from, directly lifted from the Srimad Bhagavata. The moment I saw this, I knew that that it had to refer to that. So there is nothing. It's just that I've while I reflected on it, I got to know that it was essentially referring to the Srimad Bhagavata. So Shankara says, he who is Kala personified, he is time. And time is the most powerful of deities in the world. I mean, if you look at it, Kali is also time. It is the feminine aspect of time. If in one way, she is also the dark one, therefore she is Kali, but she is also an aspect of time. Samvatsaraha reflects a part of he who is eternal time. Eternal time. And yesterday we saw that he alone has sway over time. And Vishnu, seen in his aspect of Kala or time, is how Shankara sees it. Parashara Bhattar, being the Bhakta that he is, says, he who lives for his devotees and their upliftment. Not very different if you actually parse this very closely. What he's essentially saying is that that's why he included the lives within quotes. Parashara is saying that he lives forever. That is what he means in his cryptic phrase. But he lives for the devotees and their upliftment alone, because Parashara cannot relate to any other aspect of the divine, being a Bhakta himself. So I'll read from the blog very, very briefly. I don't know what is the time right now, because I don't know how much time we still have for today, for the morning session.
Yeah, you have time, Ramesh. It's 11:05 now.
Okay, yeah.
You can speak for another 30 minutes, then we will take up some questions.
Yeah. Okay. With reference to this name, And interpreting it in the context of this string, uh, I write, I have gone with Shankara's interpretation of this name. That is, like I mentioned, that's why I included this also. I also included it because a specific question was asked and written about Yoga Nidra. I think that was the question. Therefore, Yoga Nidra appears here. The Srimad Bhagavata, Skanda 3, chapter 11, gives us a glimpse of the concept of time as envisaged in Hindu Dharma. It says, for the Brahmaloka and the realms outside the universe, a day of Brahma is equal to the 4 yugas multiplied by 1,000. His night is of equal duration. Creation starts at Brahma's waking and continues for the entire duration of the day. When he approaches his night, that is Brahma's night, he stops all activities, dissolves everything in himself, and he himself dissolves into that being and sleeps. Now, Vishnu, who is Padmanabha, is beyond all of this, because out of the Padmanabha, Brahma himself appeared. It is said that when he exhales, when Vishnu exhales, he creates many universes, the multiverses. And in those multiverses, or many universes, he places one Brahma in each universe. And when he inhales, they all go back into his cosmic form of Yoga Nidra. That is what is the cosmic form. When everything ceases and everything goes back into its state of absolute dissolution and absolute, there is nothing, there is no form, there is nothing. It's how the world existed before even creation, before the Big Bang happened. That's one way of looking at it. And this is the giant cycle of Kala or time that he holds complete sway over. There are 4 yugas, and each yuga consists of a fixed number of years. And note that the number of years in each yuga is the descending ratio of 4, 3, 2, 1. So you have the Satya Yuga, which is 17,28,000 years or 1.728 million years. The Treta Yuga, which is 1.296 million years. The Dwapara, which is about 0.864 million years. And Kali Yuga, which is about 4.32 million years. And again, if you read the Swami Tapasyananda, he describes this in much greater detail and with greater felicity than I'm bringing it out here. Since it's huge, it's he dedicates an entire chapter to it. The 4 yugas together constitute one Mahayuga or Chatur Yuga, which is equal to 4.32 million human years. And 1,000 such Mahayugas, that is 4.32 million years multiplied by 1,000, which is 4.32 billion human years, makes one Kalpa or one day of Brahma. Each Kalpa is then divided into 14 Manvantaras, with each Manvantara headed by a Manu. In other words, each Manvantara consists of 71.4 Chaturyugas. And 14 such Manvantara cycles adds up to one Kalpa. It's not important for anybody to understand this very closely, because it's something that you can read and quickly get. After each Manvantara, there is a short interlude called the Sandhya Kala, equivalent to one Satya Yuga, 1.728 million years. And we are believed to be in the reign of the 7th Manu, Vaivasvata. That is why some people who know about the Sankalpa mantra will say that we will say Samasta Dirutaksha Dwara and Vaivasvada Manvantara, which is what we say in the Sankalpa mantra, Vaivasvada Manvantare. And within this Vaivasvada Manvantare, we are in the 28th Chaturyuga. Again, we say this in the Sankalpa mantra, Ashtavimshatitame, which is 28. A similar 4.32 billion years is the day of Brahma. A similar 4.32 billion years constitutes the night of Brahma, which is the mini pralaya, when nothing exists, adding up to a total of 8.64 billion years. If you look at the scientific aging of the universe itself, it will not be very far, and you can Google it and check it. You will find that it's not very far from how our own the Pauranikas have arrived at it. I don't know how they arrived at it, but they have. And a similar 4.32 billion years constitutes the night of Brahma, adding up to a total of 8.64 billion years, which is the calculated when everything. And from now, the numbers are so mind-boggling, they take one's breath away. As we have seen, 8.64 billion years is the one full day of Brahma, day and night included. 365 such days constitute 1 year of Brahma. And on this basis, his lifespan is 100 years, which translates to roughly 311 to 315.36 trillion years. And this is one breath of Vishnu, and therefore one of his names is Samvatsaraha. He who exhales and inhales the universes and all beings within. You don't have to believe any of this if you don't want to, but in order for you to, in order to bring about a sense of awe and splendor of that great being, and in order to sit, when you sit down to meditate or contemplate, the sheer awe and splendor that this explanation gives you alone matters, and push you down into, push you through, push you up a few notches in your own understanding of how this is. And even in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 11, 32, verse 32, Krishna himself, or rather Bhagavan himself says, I am time, who takes along his wake the worlds, their creation, destruction, and annihilation. In the mighty arc of time, the warriors assembled here at this Kshetra have already been marked by me for death, and therefore shall cease to exist. He has not added it, but I add, and therefore you are a nimitta matram and only an instrument. So go ahead and stop this, worrying and wondering about whether you should perform dharma or not. Just go ahead and do it because it's already done for you. So it's his inner voice that is speaking. So this is Samvatsaraha as I see it, and therefore. Then the next name is Sharmaha. Okay, and he whose name is Sharma is what I think here there is absolute harmony in how Shankara and both as well as sorry both Shankara as well as Parashara see this. He whose name is Sharma, which stands for the Supreme Brahman, which is his very existence. His very nature is that of that Supreme Bliss, the Satchidananda. Both Shankara and Parashara. So I'll read from how I've viewed this. That Vishnu, who is Suresha and Sharanam, the previous two names in this string, and I keep forgetting this. Sharmaha is it is 87th name. That Vishnu, who is the Suresha and Sharanam, the previous two names in the string, exists as pure consciousness, and that consciousness is of the nature of Sukhis. The Satchidanandam, that is Sat Chit Ananda, the pure essence, consciousness, supreme bliss, triune, three in one, as Aurobindo sees it, or as Vivekananda says, existence in his pithy way, existence, knowledge, absolute bliss. And as Aurobindo points out in this quote below, the divine is seen in its multiple manifestations and aspects and is present in each one of us, in all animate and inanimate beings. But there exists a supreme that dwells in a plane of existence that is transcendental and beyond the plane in which normal beings exist. And for normal beings to even get a glimpse of that supreme, the normal realm of existence has to necessarily be transcended. And as Aurobindo says, the divine is everywhere on all the planes of consciousness, seen by us in different ways and aspects of his being. The divine can be and is everywhere, masked or half manifest, or beginning to be manifest in all the planes of consciousness. And that is how people are. There are people who are, who have a greater understanding of things. There are people who are more devoted. There are people who have moved up and all of these things, and which is what Aurobindo is referring to. But there is a supreme which is above all of these planes and ways and aspects, and from which they all come. Aurobindo says, and he is that Sharma. There is also mention of this in multiple Upanishads. Shvetashvatara Upanishad mentions this in the verses 1.8, 1.10, 1.12, which discusses the nature of the world, the individual self, and the supreme being. And very quickly, if I had to paraphrase what the Upanishad says, the world that we live in is an admixture of the perishable and the imperishable, that which is manifest and those that are unmanifest. All of these are seemingly inseparably bound together, that we don't know what is spiritual and what is not. The Supreme Being makes no distinction and supports all of these as the great foundation of the entire universe. As long as the individual Atman is bound together with the material world, it remains disconnected from its source. The moment the individual Atman sees the reality, the fetters of the world fall away, is what the Upanishad says. It further adds that matter is perishable and therefore its nature is asat, untrue. The Supreme is imperishable and unchanging and therefore he is Sat. Meditation on that Sat as the only reality leads to the realization of that Sat, who is the Supreme Brahman. And I think I've also quoted from in a conversation with one of his disciples. That's how Vivekananda explains how he himself experienced this state of absolute oneness and unparalleled bliss. Sachidananda, one of the few people who actually talked about that experience. Even Ramakrishna could not speak about it. And Vivekananda used to pester Ramakrishna to tell him, why don't you show me that state? Why don't you show me that state? So when he actually went into that state and he could not, he did not know what he had to do. Some of the disciples came running around to say that, Vivekananda is saying that he can't find his head. And Ramakrishna jocularly says, he's been pestering me enough. Let him stay in that state and not find his head for some time. So, I'll quote from what Vivekananda says. One day in the Kausipur garden, I had expressed my prayer to Sri Ramakrishna with great earnestness. Then in the evening, the prayer was about that state of absolute bliss. Then in the evening, at the hour of meditation, I lost the consciousness of the body and felt that it was absolutely non-existent. I felt that the sun, the moon, the space, time, ether, and all had been reduced to a homogeneous mass and then melted far away into the unknown. The body consciousness that I had all along had almost vanished, and I had nearly merged in the Supreme. But I seemed to have just a trace of the feeling of ego, so I could again return to the world of relativity from that state of samadhi. In this state of samadhi, all the differences between I and the Brahman, God, the absolute divine consciousness goes away. Everything is reduced to unity, like the waters of the infinite ocean. Water everywhere. That is all I saw. Nothing else exists. Language and thought all fail there. Then only is the state beyond mind and speech realized in its actuality. Otherwise, so long as the religious aspirant thinks or says, I am the Brahman, I and the Brahman, these two entities persist. There is the involved semblance of duality. And after that experience, even after trying repeatedly, I failed to bring back the state of samadhi. Vivekananda never could go back to that. On informing Sri Ramakrishna about it, he said, that is, Ramakrishna said, if you remain day and night in that state, who will do the work of the Divine Mother? The work of the Divine Mother will not be accomplished. Therefore, you won't be able to induce that state again. When your work is finished, it will come again. This is how he said, I've locked it up forever, and I hold the key, and I'll give you the key when I think your work is done. So this is how I have seen Sharma, how the absolute bliss is to be seen. I think we might have time for two more names today, and that is we will look at Duradarshaha. And again, here both Shankara and Parashara Bhattar see it exactly the same. Duradarshaha is he who cannot be assailed, attacked, or defeated by the Asuras, or for that matter, by anyone. He who cannot be overcome by anyone, that powerful being who can never be defeated. On this point, both of them are, see it exactly the same. So that is Duradarshaha. I'll read from how I've, interpreted this. This is the name of that supreme being that comes up in a string that talks of contentment, order, discernment, courage, and the bow-wielding Sri Rama, and the soaring Garuda, and nothing could be more apt. At one level, the need to destroy all that is useless, disorder, confusion and delusion, fear, etc., is crucial to make the necessary progress in the inward journey. At the same time, this name is also a clarion call to what our true legacy is. This is how I've reflected on it, and this is how I've written about it. So, That every time, I'll read that again. At the same time, this name is also a clarion call to what our true legacy is. That every time the needle of Dharma tilts, the balance shifts, then he will come to push the needle back and right the balance. And he will do that not through words and pious pleading, but through samhara, annihilation of the wicked and the slaughter of the asuras. Take the avatars of Vishnu itself. Read what Varaha did to Hiranyaksha when he kidnapped Bhuma Devi and hid her under the waters. Varaha decimated the hordes of Rakshasas and pummeled Hiranyaksha to death with his bare hands. So angry was he that when he let out that primeval scream before diving into the waters, it sent a shiver down the spine of the Devas as well. And they all had to close their ears because the ears were ringing, the sound of that scream that Varaha Murthy gave. Then look at Narasimha and his samhara of Hiranyaksha's brother Hiranyakashipu. Parashurama, who killed the entire dynasty of Kartavirya Arjuna and all the Kshatriyas on earth 21 times over in order to lessen the burden of the world and rectify the balance of Dharma once again. Or look at the destruction of the Rakshasas at Janasthana, in the Ramayana that is, Dandakaranya, and the samhara of the clan of Ravana at the hands of the greatest wielder of the bow that we have known in our Dharma, which is Sri Rama. Because even Krishna in his Bhagavad Gita says, if you want to identify me with warriors, identify me with Rama. Of the bow wielding and weapon wielding ones, I am Rama. Know me as Rama, he says. And then the killing field of Kurukshetra, carefully orchestrated by the Kshetrajna, who chose to remain a Parthasarathi, charioteer of Partha Arjuna, but still oversaw the greatest massacre that pushed the needle back and balanced the scales of Dharma. And what to say of Chandika or the Raudra Rupas of our other devas and deities? And I continue to reflect on this as follows. It is in this context that the misplaced and misunderstood concept of ahimsa that has somehow come to be seen and often practiced as a central tenet of Hindu Dharma seems so baffling. Patanjali may have included ahimsa as one of the yamas or the disciplines in spiritual practices. But that is an injunction to the sadist who takes pleasure in inflicting pain on innocents and for those without a moral compass, or an injunction for the sannyasi. It cannot be a broad brush to paint the entire Dharma with and straitjacket an entire community into following it or to be defined by it. Today, that is how we are defined. We are ahimsavadis. We will not, we will tolerate everything that is thrown at us. I don't subscribe to that. Neither does our own Dharma subscribe to it. If somebody says that ahimsa is the paramo dharma of our Dharma, then it is adharma because you won't find it anywhere else. And I think Nitin is a better person to comment on where it is actually located. But and therefore this whole thing, we are in fact the legatees of a Dharma that asks us to go forth as lions and not be meek as lambs, which is what we have become because we've been consistently told that our that the central core of our Dharma is ahimsa. Nothing can be further from the truth. Nothing can be as wrong as that. And I want to emphasize this as clearly as possible. And for that, I want to use the example of somebody who I've known as the most gentle of beings. And I continue to reflect and write in the blog. Someone as gentle as the Kanchi Paramacharya himself is on record saying that the blanket application of ahimsa is wrong, impractical, and morally improper, he says. And an excerpt from an interview with Dr. J.W. Elder, who was then the assistant professor of sociology, the University of Wisconsin, Madison, US, who came to interview the Paramacharya. Dr. Elder asks, ahimsa has sometimes been included as one of the major teachings within Hinduism. In view of the recent Chinese attack on India, what would your interpretation be of the present day application of this principle of ahimsa? The Paramacharya of Kanchi, Sri Chandrasekharendra Saraswati says, I think you are basing your question on ahimsa as Gandhi interpreted it. Gandhi, in turn, based his belief and ideas about ahimsa on Lord Buddha. I might add here, like I'm adding here just now, that it is also based on the Jaina principles of Mahavira, who was one of the staunchest proponents of ahimsa. And the Paramacharya goes on to say, Gandhi in turn based his belief and ideas about ahimsa on Lord Buddha. Both of them, in my opinion, were failures. This is my viewpoint, says the Kanchi Paramacharya. When Nehru sent the Indian army to Kashmir in 1947, he said that he was sending the army after consulting and taking instructions from Gandhi. Hence, isn't it Gandhi's failure in ahimsa if he himself has agreed to send the army? There is one version of Lord Buddha's death according to which he ate flesh and dies as a consequence. Most of the Buddhist monks are non-vegetarians in the Buddhist countries such as Ceylon, Burma, Malaya, and China. Therefore, should I say that Buddha's ahimsa has also failed? Asks the Paramacharya. And then he goes on to clarify. I think the correct interpretation of ahimsa is that it is a virtue applicable only to the highest ashrama, the sannyasi. When he has renounced the world, he should do no violence at all, not even pluck a leaf if he can from a tree. If anybody beats him, he should do nothing to defend himself, and he should receive them with joy. But this doctrine of ahimsa is not meant to be applied to nations and nation states or to the leader of the nations. Some feel that ahimsa brought India her independence. That is not actually the case, says the Kanchi Paramacharya. The English had their own reasons for setting India free, whether or not we had been practicing ahimsa. And then he goes on to say, according to the Shastras, the rigid application of the principles of ahimsa are not applicable to the government or the leaders. Our Shastras make it clear that a ruler who does not defend his country fails in his duty. And to think that in 1947, one of the recommendations was that India need not have a standing army. No, that is a recommendation that was made. Fortunately, we did not, implement that recommendation. The Kanchi Paramacharya goes on to say, the rules of defending the country are not only for China, but for the nation. That is, he says, not just in the context of defending against China, but something that the nation needs. Of course, a leader should not wage an aggressive war, but at the same time, nor should he refuse to defend his country if it is attacked. In fact, if a citizen is attacked by another citizen, our Shastras make it clear that it is the duty of the government to protect its citizen, even if it means capital punishment for the offender. Further, the Shastras have made it clear to what extent everybody should follow ahimsa, and that is how the principle of ahimsa has to be applied, says the Kanchi Paramacharya. Everybody who has known him knows that he was the gentlest of people. He could not even harm a little ant, but this is his stated position on that principle of ahimsa. And therefore,
we lost you in between.
Okay.
Yeah.
For how long, Nitin?
Just last 30 seconds.
So is there a point at which
And I think he was mentioning what Kanchi Paramacharya said. He said,
okay. Yeah, so I'll read the last paragraph. He says, the Kanchi Paramacharya says, apparently I was lost. According to the Shastras, the rigid application of the principles of ahimsa are not applicable to the government or to the leaders. Our Shastras make it clear that a ruler who does not defend his country fails in his duty. The rules of defending the country are not only for China, that is not only in the context of China, but for the entire nation, which means you need to have an army, he says. Of course, a leader should not wage an aggressive war, but at the same time, nor should he refuse to defend his country if it is attacked. If a citizen is attacked by another citizen, our Shastras make it clear that it is the duty of the government to protect its citizen, even if it means capital punishment for the offender. Further, the Shastras have made it clear to what extent everyone should follow ahimsa and to what extent it should not be followed. I think, so this is about Duradarsha and as how I interpret it in terms of its present applicability also, because I think it's also important that many of these names also make sense in the present context without stripping them of their essential spiritual core. I think that is essential, because you have some authors, I refuse to take names, but some authors who will write interpretations of how they see it and then end up completely stripping the central core of the dharma itself. That is not done, but at the same time it should make sense in the present context as well. So it needs to be, and that is the whole purpose of also reflecting in terms of its applicability now in the now and the here. So the next word name that I've taken up, do we have time for it?
Yeah, go ahead. Take
Yeah.
have 10 minutes.
Because I
10 to 15.
don't see many questions. I think, yeah. So,
Yeah, 2 3 questions
and I
are
think
there.
the
So,
question that is, yeah, the question that is there also has already been addressed. So yeah.
yeah,
So the next name that we discuss is Kramaha, where it's seen as he who moves and is the cause of all motion at the level of the macrocosm and the microcosm. He who is the vehicle to cross the ocean of samsara, as Shankara sees it. And Parashara Bhattar, however, sees it as he who puts all things in order, he who is prosperous by virtue of being the master of eternal and transcendental glory. It's one part of this which I did not find much connectivity in the entire thread that of this, but apparently he must have also had the reasons for it. And I'll read from what I wrote here in the blog. This is one of the names, one of those names that is difficult to interpret. If it was only movement that is talked about, then that is covered by other names. So because Shankara talks about movement, if it is about crossing the ocean of samsara, then one could argue that that too is covered by the previous name Vikramaha, where even the way is pointed out to us in the form of that great bird of soaring consciousness, Garuda. I also find Parashara Bhattar's interpretation, at least one of his interpretations, to be a jarring note in a string where one name dovetails with the other, and this name seems to be a little out of sync with the names in the string. This interpretation, prosperous, may well be in line with the rules of grammar, and it is, but isn't the Supreme Being beyond all rules? Further, if our premise is that each name must have a meaning contextually or in conjunction with another name or even independently, then we must look for possible meanings outside these two interpretations as well that are given by the two great commentators. One of the meanings of the word krama is also order and structure, besides progress and forward motion. And progress or movement, to be worthwhile, needs to be ordered and structured in its very essence. Most people dissipate energy in being busy, but do not really know what it means to act. To act necessarily means to be in flow. Most things we observe in nature that have not been tampered with by human intervention are in a rhythmic and natural flow. It is only humans who seem to have lost this connection and don't know how to act. To hurry has come to symbolize most of us and our actions. Even when we are silent, we are not really silent. The chatter of the entire universe is in our head. Our limbs are as disoriented as our thoughts because we can't even sit for some time. And this is how I reflected on it and write about it. Most often, our mind races ahead of us such that our mind is working on something else, even as we in capitals, are working on something entirely different, our physical being. A speeding mind invariably has an effect on the physical as well, and in all that we do. The krama, orderly flow that should be life, then becomes akrama, disjointed, disorderly, and out of flow. Slowing down does not translate into lethargy. It essentially means to gain mastery over the manas, the mind, such that it works for you and with you and does not constantly race ahead of you. When every task that you do and everything you do is in the full light of the purpose and its significance, when you can sift the wheat from the chaff, this viveka or discernment is what Vishnu provides. And when he becomes the guiding principle, the inner controller, then krama, I think I mentioned this, that is orderly flow, becomes second nature, and life itself starts to flow naturally and unperturbed. Again, in the Bhagavad Gita, he himself says, verse 16, what does it mean to act and what is inaction? Even those who appear to be wise or think are wise seem to find this difficult and confusing to comprehend and determine. And then he says, I shall tell you the secret of work, the way it has to be done, and the viveka, a discernment to differentiate between the two. action and inaction. This should help liberate you. And again, you will find this is now, made into a great management principle. But again, we find that, we already have it. The essential need to slow down and, not multitask, focus on one task, do things one after the other, and all of those things which have become great management principles and people have written books are already right here. Those, and he says, those who are able to see action in inaction and inaction in inaction, they are truly wise. This essentially means that the wise know how to carefully choose where they need to focus their attention and energy, because where your attention goes, there your energy too goes. They never fritter away their time in wasteful work. Is essentially what Krishna is trying to say. And like I said, this has become a big management principle as well right now. And I also in the blog, take a passage from the House of the Lord, which gives a glimpse into Sri Aurobindo's time spent in convalescence after he had fractured his leg. A rhythm, steadiness, and silence were the music of his life. Every small or simple act was measured and steady, filled with an immeasurable calmness. And the passage below captures his mood even while doing something as mundane as eating. Most of us sit in front of the television, or hold it in our hands while we eat. But look at how we but well, the thing is that one of the injunction is that, when you eat, you don't even speak. My guru, who taught me Vedas for 1 year in Bangalore, was so strict about these things that he used to sit in absolute silence. His name was Sri Anantanarayanan, and he used to say, and if the people who were serving him did not notice, he never opened his mouth and asked for a second. And so, in order to ensure that he never took a second serving, what he used to do is that he stopped taking second servings at all. And he was not some guru who, only taught. He was a corporate lawyer who worked with the Bank of Baroda for a long time, and he continued to practice corporate law. And even as he, went about doing all of these things, and what I learned from him is that how much you can do in a day if your energies are not dissipated. He used to teach Vedas in the morning. He used to do there is a website that he created called pradosha.com. He uploaded a book on how to do basic puja, and gave it away free. And and he continued to practice corporate law as well. And he was, and so that is how he says that is what comes from krama, order. And I quote from how this steadiness and silence were the characteristic stamps of Sri Aurobindo. Dhira, according to him, Dhira was the ideal of the Aryan culture. Hurry and hustle were words not found in his dictionary, be it eating, drinking, walking, or talking. He did it always in a slow and measured rhythm, giving the impression that every moment was sacred, conscious, and consecrated. The mother would punctuate the silence with queries like, "How do you like that dish?" Or such remarks as, "This mushroom is grown here. This is a special brinjal sent from Banaras, and this is a butterfruit that was grown in this garden." To all, Sri Aurobindo's reply would always be, "Oh, I see. Quite good." Typically English in manner and tone, his silence or laconic praise made us wonder if he had not lost all distinction in taste. And since did a rasagulla, bread and brinjal have the same taste in that divine sense experience of Aurobindo? And Aurobindo was a mind reader. So quickly he said, he making this vital point clear, he said, distinction is never lost. Bread cannot be as tasty as a luchi, but a yogi can enjoy bread with as much rasa as he does rasagulla, which is quite a different thing. So this is about the name Krama and how I've interpreted it in the blog. And as I keep mentioning, all of these things are available on the blog and will also be, whereas a compendium of all that is written with an additional prelude and all of those things would be coming out as a book very soon. So that is. So the next name that we have as part of this one.
Ramesh, do you want to take some questions?
Yeah. Yeah, I can take a question.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one question which we had was you mentioned about I think Kali, I think in the context as dark and time. So the question is, what is
That
the commonality between dark and time?
actually there is no commonality. That is a term that actually Ramakrishna used to use. He said she's the dark one, the Kali, and also the darkness also was symbolic to him of her nature of destroying all the evil tendencies and bringing out all that is sattvic in people. Too often, we look at Kali, and he had this wonderful interpretation of her, where he asked her, what is she doing? Why is she, why is her tongue out and all that? He used to say, she is biting her tongue because she suddenly realized that she's actually standing on her own husband, Shiva, and therefore it's that sense of she suddenly realized that. And typically how we bite our tongue when we are caught doing what we should not be doing is her reaction. So it is his term that I used. And Kali also means the dark one, and she is the dark one. And her nature is also that of time, because it is a play upon the word Kala, and as Mahakala is also, and therefore it is in that context that the dark and the time is used. And the whole idea is that nothing new can come. Too often we worry about destruction, we worry about death or decay and all of those things. But it's also true that for something to be born anew, there must be the darkness of death, there must be the darkness of dark time, there must be the darkness of destruction, because without death there is no life. And I mean, that is essentially how this is interpreted, at least how I see it. So
If I may add for the benefit of the uh, viewers, one of the texts, I don't remember the name, one of the tantric texts, it says that um, Mahakala devours the whole universe, and
yeah,
Kali is she who devours Mahakala himself. That is,
yeah,
Mahakala stands for time, and Kali devours time itself. That is, she is Parabrahman who is beyond time, who transcends time. And the other aspect of the blackness, it again is connected to this Laya itself, because the it represents a state of absorption or the laya, wherein the whole universe is absorbed back into a state of what is called as mula prakriti, state of uh, um, formlessness, so to speak. And this formlessness is depicted through black, state of shunyata. In the Upanishads they speak. In the beginning there was only waters, or in the beginning there was nothing. This waters is basically a term used in the Upanishads to refer to unmanifested Prakriti, Prakriti in a state of unmanifestation. And this is what the blackness actually refers to.
thanks. And I must add here that Nitin is the expert on anything on Shastra. Direct your questions to, or anything on the Divine Mother. He's laughing, but I've read most of things. He's even written a book on that. So anything on the Divine Mother or anything on Dharma Shastras, I think he's the, even I always go to him to get some references also. Can we take up one more name, or do we have the time for it?
I think there was one more question. I think you should answer that, and then we have 15 minutes more.
Okay.
Uh, the one of the question was one thought as to why Indian philosophy shuns materialism is protection against the power of Maya snares. That's why Ramakrishna, I think this is merely a comment, not a question. I think
Yeah, it's only a
that's
comment.
Ramakrishna says, realize God before you indulge in this world.
Yeah, I
Um,
think he says that. I think he repeatedly says that to the monks also. I think, but yeah, I
but
mean, he even used to say that keep away. Vivekananda did so many experiments. He placed some money underneath his bed, and Ramakrishna was in so much pain and all that. So that is, yeah. So, but that was for Ramakrishna. I don't think we can. I don't think none of us can even imagine the kind of state that he was in. I don't think even Vivekananda was in that state ever. So I think, yeah. So
yeah,
that is,
I personally think these teachings from the great masters, they have to be taken with a kind of a nuance rather than literal, in
Absolutely.
the sense that he's teaching, I mean, the current kind of the whole current narrative is that Hinduism, as the comment says, it shuns materialism. It is only about moksha. It is not about dharma, artha, kama, or especially about not about artha and kama. I think this is a kind of a misleading narrative as a whole, and this has resulted in a lot of problems of its own. The suppression of kama and artha has resulted in kind of a perversion uh, getting into the society. So so I just a clarification. I think I don't know whether
Yeah.
will
And again,
this
continuing from where Nitin left off, I think if you read Ramakrishna's Sri Ramakrishna's the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which is the translation, he will keep saying, the monks. It was an injunction to the monks. I've seen articles where he says stay away from kama and kanta, which meant there's a lust and women. So you will. I've seen articles that say he was not a feminist. Of course, he was not a feminist. I mean, that's the thing. And he was against women. He was not. Even I mean, the way he treated women was completely different. But it was an injunction for the monks, where it is actually essential. He was speaking to the monks, and it has been faithfully written down. So to take things out of context like this and say he was like that, I'm sure Nitin knows the specific articles that I'm referring to, where this particular phrase, because you'll see it scattered across the gospel repeatedly. He'll say avoid this, avoid that. So but he for when he spoke to women, you will notice that he'll say avoid these men, avoid these boys, he will say. So that was what he was like. But we conveniently take things out of context. And as Nitin rightly pointed out, don't there is an element of nuance that we need to bring into uh, understanding each of these things, and that nuance will come from reflective reading and not just superficial reading of each one. So it takes time. Like I said, if you had, for example, just to give you an example, to finish the essays on the Gita is roughly runs it about 450 to 500 pages, Aurobindo. My assessment is that if you it should take you no less than a year to actually complete it, even if you read consistently. That is how difficult that book is. I mean, because each word, each para, each page has to be reflected upon. And people who run through books saying that I want to complete 10 books by this year, I don't think much is accomplished by reading in that fashion. I'm going to complete 15 books. I would rather that you spread yourself thick, focus on a few things. Like I said, I like Nitin, if you want to talk about when you have somebody like Nitin Sridhar, or some of our friends like Rajarshi or somebody on specific aspects, you already have people who know a lot more than you. Then why also waste time reading about it, is how I see that. And focus on the things that interest us, and focus on the things that we are better able to grasp, and spreading yourself thick rather than thin is what
Yeah, I think on Gita, one very less read and but very important book is this commentary of Madhusudana Saraswati, which is a
right.
huge book,
I know
and
you
it has
mentioned it.
been
Yeah, yeah.
translated by Swami Gambhirananda. I have one more question. You discussed about this yuga cycle and
Mhm.
yuga cycle and the large number of, how the duration of yuga. See, I personally adhere to the Pauranic yuga cycles,
I've
but
taken it. Yeah, I've taken it
but
from the Srimad Bhagavata only.
yes,
Yes,
yes. So, but of late, there are scholars who have come up with, uh, statements about
then I know who you are referring to, and
uh,
we've had
uh,
several.
without taking any names, but
Ah,
because there are many who argue that these larger numbers are merely metaphors, and they say that we have to take into account a smaller yuga cycle, like, which runs up to say 1,000, 2,000, or 3,000 years or something like that. So, what is your opinion?
uh, I know I know even the people you're referring to, and like you mentioned, we will not take names. I also, briefly, I've to be honest, frank, I have not even been able to sit through many of the sessions that they have conducted, and also read many of the articles that they have written. So it will be premature for me to comment on what their thinking is. I also know that I don't remember. Was it uh, the the one who wrote the Autobiography of Yogi, Paramahamsa Yogananda.
Yes, yes, yes.
His,
There also it mentions. Yeah.
his guru, I forget his name. His guru
Uh,
also, gives a different cycle of the yugas. I've read that also.
yes.
But I would, and I also know the recent commentators who have tried to push back the dates of the Mahabharata or push forward the dates of the Ramayana and all of these things based on archaeoastronomy, astronomy, and all of those things. And also, we have people who are talking about shorter yuga cycles and other things. But as I mentioned there itself, I still like the fact that, metaphorically speaking, the sheer awe and splendor that it gives you when you contemplate that supreme being who holds sway over time like this, and shows you how minuscule and how infinitesimal that you actually are. I think that is what I see as important. Don't really go about it in terms of researching, is this true, is this not true. I think too much time, like I said, is frittered away in doing all of these things that we are trying to. That is my personal opinion. I mean, people are free to spend time researching other things, but if your goal is to understand your own self, all this and if that is the ultimate thing, then you might much rather view it as the absolute you view it as the great awe and splendor that comes out of reading a passage like that in a book that is by even the most conservative accounts at least 2000 years old, that somebody that some mind could actually contemplate time like that is itself, and that there is a supreme being who holds sway over time across such a vast expanse is in itself, I think, the most important thing that we need to focus on. I think that's my
Yeah. I think one of the viewers is asking about the recordings. Please follow Advaita Academy YouTube channel. Recording will be uploaded in maybe 2 to 3 days,
oh,
and you can
yeah, while
check
we
them out there.
yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Sorry. While we struggled with the names, I think Professor Sharma has come up with the name. It's Swami Yuktananda. He's the one who was
Yes, yes. So
the
somebody is asking about the details you mentioned about elders interview with Kanchi Parmacharya, right? So where in which book is it mentioned? Where can
you will find it. There is an article. I can send it if somebody wants it. There's a PDF of the photograph of that is available, and also it's available. Or you can go to the Kanchi site. I don't know the exact. I think it's kanchikamakoti.org or something. You'll find it.
kamakoti.org.
Kamakoti.org.
I think we are almost out of time, Ramesh. So I will ask one light-hearted question. I think we have just
Ah,
5 more minutes left. So you can take up the next name in the evening session. I think that would be better. Uh, uh, among all the names, I am sure you have already read the Vishnu Sahasranama many times. So among all the names, uh, which is your favorite name? If you have to choose just one name out of the thousand.
oh, this is difficult. This is a difficult. I don't actually. I've not thought of it on that lines. Uh, hmm. So if you're thinking, that means the answer is not going to be correct. If I'm thinking about it, it should come naturally to me, and it's not coming. So which means that I've actually not thought of it on those lines of which is my favorite, because each name, when I sit down and reflect on it, seems to throw up one aspect, and each name is a part description of that supreme being, and therefore to say that this name is better or something. But I like the name that the I like the Sharanam name, which is about, because I think that's the only way to approach this, that you completely get into his Sharanam as in and you can also connect it back to the whole principle of the temple itself, how it's constructed, and how each time you go to the sanctum sanctorum, it's about going to the Sharanam, and all that is done in the temple itself. So I think, yeah, if I had to be forced to make a choice, I'll make that as the name, as
Okay.
far as so far, because I'll say that I'll not comment on any of the names outside of 108. I made that. So also, although like you say, I've already read those names, but still, yeah.
So you mentioned throughout lessons yesterday you have been mentioning this many times that you take one name and sit in reflection on those names. So I think this is an important point. A lot of people read these names or they even chant it on a regular basis, but they do not spend time to reflect on those names. So I just want to know from you, do you follow some kind of a personal ritual when you sit for reflection? Or is it just that you keep reflecting throughout the day? Or do you have a time and place where you sit and you do some kind of personal ritual where you reflect on it?
Okay, that's a good question. But what has worked is I don't do any, I don't sit in one place. But what I do is the moment I wake up, which is quite early in the morning, at about 5 o'clock, is the first thing that I do is to open and read the name, both the Shankara's interpretation and the Parashara's. And then I let go. And the name keeps churning. And I wait till the very last moments so that I can, because then once the, in a symbolic sense, the gate opens, writing is very easy. It takes me just 10 minutes to quickly type out what I want to write, or 10, or at the most half an hour or 45 minutes. Because the difficult part is what you want, how you want to connect it. It's not this one, because and it honestly happens only like this for me, is that it's when you, but that is a ritual. If you want to say what ritual is it, I don't sit or something. You just take up one name and read it the first thing in the morning,
Mhm.
uh, and just look at that name. And then like I said, once the name gets in and you've read it, and even if I don't read the Shankara Parashara commentary, nowadays I know what each name refers to. So therefore, just reading the name once, the reading itself is that act of just saying, okay, this is what we're going to do, and then it keeps churning in the mind the whole day. Sometimes it appears quickly, then I quickly write it up at 4 o'clock in the morning itself, 5 o'clock, and then time it to be published at around 5:36. But sometimes it never comes. The answers don't come, or I don't know what to write. Then it might be 5 o'clock, 5:30 or something. But moment it comes, yeah, once the gates open, it's like a floodgate. You can write and finish it quickly.
Wonderful. That
Yeah.
I think a lot of viewers have gained much, not only from your analysis of the names, but also from the process, your own personal journey into Vishnu Sahasranama. I think this has been quite inspiring and fascinating to viewers and to me personally as well. And so I think we are almost up in today's now session. So we will wrap it up now. Viewers, please know that we have another session in the evening from 4 to 6, and this that will be the concluding session for this weekend's weekend with wisdom. And if you have not registered, please register for the evening session. And the registration link was already given in the chat box at the beginning of the session. Please go there and register. Do not miss the concluding session. Ramesh will be discussing few more interesting names, and he will be sharing few more interesting tidbits. With this, I thank you, Ramesh, again for
Thank you.
appearing on our show,
Everyone.
and uh, such a mesmerizing, I should say, sessions since yesterday. Uh, with this, we conclude today's session. Shri Guru Pyo Namaha.
Thank you.